I'll be reading Luke 7:39. When the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, "If this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner."
Good morning, everybody. Well, because we had daylight savings time, that means I get to preach an extra hour, right? That's how that works? Johnny, I told you they wouldn't like that joke. So Johnny comes to me one day in the office and he says, "Hey, I think the next series I do is going to be about tables." And I said, "Neat. What about them?" You're going to have to give me a little bit more information. And he started telling me about a lot of the powerful moments that took place around tables, like Passover, the Lord's Supper, and Mephibosheth, who he started this series with. And he asked me if there was any that I thought of and that I wanted to talk about. And as soon as he did, I knew exactly which story I wanted to talk about. In Luke 7, Jesus is anointed by a sinful and shameful woman. And I wanted to talk about this because I know that shame can be a very powerful thing, very destructive thing, a very deceptive thing. It can halt progress in our lives. And as I was getting ready to talk about this, I noticed in a lot of the Gospels that there's this weird thing that Jesus does where he will often bring up someone's most shameful secret. He brings up things that people are ashamed of. And a great example of this is the woman at the well. He just kind of casually brings up her husband. This is multiple. And he doesn't do this to make her feel guilty or to embarrass her or to shame her, but because he wants to deal with her guilt and her shame. He wants her to know that he fully knows her, all of the secrets, all of the darkness that she tries to hide, but yet still fully loves her. He does this again when he meets Peter for the first time, or Simon, as he was known then. And this is right after a night of unsuccessful fishing. He had fished all night and caught nothing. And as he's preaching, he says, "Hey, Simon, let's let out the nets for a catch." And he has to own up to what happened in front of all these people. And he says, "I tried all night and I wasn't able to catch anything." He didn't have to say that, but I think that he does because Jesus touches on a source of shame for Peter. He's the fisherman who caught no fish. And so we talk about removing guilt all the time, right? We don't use it in those words exactly. We talk about how we've been set free, how Jesus died for our sins and we are declared innocent. But we don't talk about shame enough. And because of that, we might believe that they are synonyms, that they are the same things. But that's not true. Guilt is, I did something bad. There's a legal connotation to it. I broke a rule or a law. Whereas shame is, I'm bad. I'm a terrible person. Psychologists say that if the image in your mind of who you are doesn't match your actions or your words or your feelings, you will feel shame because of that when people know about it. It could be because of a habit, an addiction, a failure, a disappointment. Whatever it is, you don't want people to know about it. That's when you feel the shame, is when people realize that what you say doesn't match up with how you feel or how you think you should be. Another thing, shame is a tool used by Satan to make us feel unlovable, unusable, alone, separated from God and separated from others. And unfortunately, he uses this tool all the time because it works. Now, I don't know what your shame looks like, but I'm fairly certain that you have some, that we all have some. Maybe it's a lie that you told that spiraled into a bigger lie. Maybe you said something out of anger that you regret. Maybe a choice that you made that can't be undone. A secret sin that no one knows about. rumors that spread about you that may or may not be true, what your kids have done since they left the house, what your parents did in the past that still gets brought up today, relationships that you've broken or couldn't fix. Whatever form it takes, we tend to carry it around with us, and it tends to be destructive and deceptive and very powerful. But the good news is that we don't have to. So our story today comes, I'm going to be reading from Luke chapter 7, but it is recorded in all four Gospels. But each author records it a little bit differently. And I'm not going to point out all the differences, I'll point out a few, but I'm going to mainly be focusing on Luke's version. And it starts in verse 36 of Luke chapter 7. It says, "When one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table." Now, this is a very small detail, but it has huge implications for us. Jesus, we know, we talk about it all the time, he ate with sinners. He also ate with Pharisees, who we know that he disagreed with. He ate with everyone to show them honor and respect. You know, he doesn't treat the Pharisees like the bad guys. He doesn't have nothing to do with them. He doesn't ignore this invitation. He's still nice to them, and I think that's definitely something we need to keep in mind in this day and time. Verse 37, "A woman in that town who lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house. So she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. She stood behind him at his feet, weeping. She began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them." John mentions the detail that when she does this, the whole house smelled like perfume. So she may have wanted to slip in unnoticed, but when everybody starts smelling perfume, they're going to start to question where that's coming from. She wouldn't be able to hide after that. She put herself in a situation where she knew she was going to be judged. She knew how the Pharisees felt about her. They had very strict guidelines. They couldn't be around sinful people. And she was undeniably sinful. But she puts all that aside and does whatever it takes to be in the presence of Jesus. And Luke mentions her posture. It's different in Luke than it is in the others, right? She stands behind Jesus, unable to face him, right? That's the depth of her shame. A lot of times we picture it kind of like this, and that might be how it's done in some of the other Gospels, but for Luke's Gospel specifically, it mentions that she is behind him, broken, ashamed. But she brings all of that to Jesus, and she makes this incredible gesture, this move of repentance and worship. Now, we're going to move over to Matthew, Mark, and John for just 1 second because they take the story in a different direction at this point. We'll come back to Luke in just a minute. But the people who are present for this dinner, when they see this happen, when they see this woman pour this perfume on Jesus, they're upset by it, right? They think that she's wasting this perfume, this expensive perfume. And so in Matthew, it's the disciples who get upset. In John, it's Judas specifically that gets upset. In Mark, it's just the other dinner guests. He doesn't specify who it is that gets upset. But they all say something very similar to what is recorded here in Matthew 26, verses 8 through 9. They say, "Why this waste?" they asked. "This perfume could have been sold at a high price and the money given to the poor." Mark tells us that they rebuked her harshly. How would you feel if you spent a lot of money on a gift for somebody and everybody else at the table said, "What a waste"? But Jesus puts a stop to that. He says in verse 10, if this thing will work, "Aware of this, Jesus said to them, 'Why are you bothering this woman? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me. When she poured this perfume on my body, she did it to prepare me for burial. Truly, I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." They call it a waste, but Jesus called it beautiful. They criticize this display of love and honor for Jesus. And they say, well, that's not what I would have done. That's not how I would have, done this nice thing for Jesus. But Jesus says, we don't need to go down that road. Stop it. Just because it's different than what we would have done doesn't mean it's necessarily wrong. Jesus defends her as an example of someone who did a good work for him. Now, her gift was extravagant, maybe even reckless, but it was an act of worship, and it will be remembered, Jesus says. When Jesus says, you will always have the poor with you, but you won't always have me, he's not trying to discourage them from being generous or kind to the poor, because we know that that would be out of character for him. But Jesus says to point out that what she did honored him just as much as when we are kind and generous to the poor. Now, I talk about all of this because this is the really cool part that I think that we might miss. I doubt she understood the full meaning of what she was doing in that moment. Jesus explained how significant it really was. In her mind, it was just this nice, expensive perfume that she wanted to give to Jesus. Maybe it was all she had. But Jesus explained it was preparation for his coming burial. And in that moment, I don't think anybody but Jesus realized how soon that was coming. Here's where it matters for us. The simplest action done for Jesus may be much greater than we can possibly imagine. What is simply a good deed in our hands is charged with eternal significance and purpose in Jesus' hands. Now, we'll go back to Luke, because the dinner guests in Luke's account, who, if you remember, are the Pharisees, they're upset about something completely different. Verse 39, when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner. Pharisees love to ruin the moment, don't they? Even though he said this to himself, Jesus still responds. This is what he says in verse 40. Jesus answered him, Simon, I have something to tell you. Simon's the name of the Pharisee, not Simon the disciple. Tell me, teacher, he said. 2 people owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii, the other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he forgave the debts of both. Now, which one of them will love him more? Simon replied, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven. You have judged correctly, Jesus said. So this woman, filled with shame, put herself out there in front of the ones who would judge her, who would remind her of her shame, who would try to remove her from the table. But Jesus tries to turn shame into rejoicing and hope and a godly identity. And then in verse 44, then he turned toward the woman. Okay, that doesn't seem like a huge deal, but remember, she was behind him. She couldn't face him. This is a huge detail that we shouldn't miss. She's in shame, she's broken, she's crying, most likely overhearing this conversation, wondering what Jesus will do next. And he turns and faces the woman. He sees her. He acknowledges her, not as a sinful woman, but as a child of God. And he says this. He says, he's looking at her, but he's speaking to Simon. He says, do you see this woman? I came into your house. You did not give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman from the time I entered has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet. Therefore, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. But whoever has been forgiven little loves little. Nothing she did was unnoticed by Jesus. In fact, he contrasts and compares to what the Pharisees didn't do for him, and it kind of makes them look inhospitable. Here's the point. God meets us in our shame. He doesn't want to leave us there. He doesn't want us to feel that way. He doesn't leave it up to us to fix it ourselves so we can come out of hiding. And we know that he won't run away. He doesn't shame us more. He doesn't rub our face in it. He turns towards you. Yeah, well, it depends on the sin. Maybe to the Pharisees. Well, it depends on how much sin. Maybe to the Pharisees. It depends on how repentant we are. Maybe to the Pharisees. In this story, God is the shepherd who left the 99 to search for the one who got away until he finds it. And now this sheep is down in the ditch, tangled up in addictions, pride, shame, guilt. He doesn't leave it there. He goes down in the ditch after it. And you see that pattern play out throughout all of the Old Testament. God doesn't have to have sinners. He wants them. He looks at them. He's constantly going after them and pursuing them. And now we see Jesus repeating the exact same pattern in the New Testament. Now, Jesus is looking at the woman. He turns towards her, but everything he's saying is for the Pharisees' benefit. But now, in case she didn't hear him, he says this. Then Jesus said to her, "Your sins are forgiven." Then the other guests began to say among themselves, "Who is this who even forgives sins?" Jesus said to the woman, "Your faith has saved you. Go in peace." Her life would definitely be different after that moment, after this encounter with Jesus. She was given an identity by the God who didn't run away from her, who didn't judge her, who saw her and embraced her even in that moment. So today, if we're hiding in our shame, God doesn't stand in judgment. He stands with arms wide open in welcome. He sees you. He turns towards you, offering you the greatest gift to come out of the darkness and into the light. Which that can be painful sometimes, to come into the light, into the presence of a holy God after being in darkness. And you may think, I don't want that. I don't want all of my shame exposed like that. But here's a challenging truth that this woman learned. Shame is all about secrets. A secret life, a secret sin, a secret addiction. The way you get rid of shame is by getting rid of the secrets. The more secrets you have, the more shame you will feel. So the challenge for us is to let it all out, put it out in the open, and know that everyone understands because we're all in the same boat. We all have shame. And more importantly than that, God already fully knows you. He knows what you're dealing with. He knows what you're ashamed of. He knows what's going on in our lives. And he still fully loves you. He still delights in you. He sees past your past to his original creation, to his child. Allow God to remove shame and guilt so that we can truly walk a new life. When our shame and darkness embrace the light of God, we aren't exposed. We aren't shamed even more. We aren't used as an example of what not to do. He turns towards us. He faces us. Shame is removed. Guilt is removed because Christ took that upon himself. He replaced our junk with grace. He gives you a new name, a new purpose, a new hope, new life, and a new identity. Because this woman didn't really deserve a place at the table. In fact, she didn't even get an invitation. Others tried to remove her once she started being there and doing these things. But everything changed when Jesus turned to face her. She poured perfume on his feet, or if you're reading Matthew and Mark, she pours it on his head. In the midst of criticism, not fully understanding the significance of what she was doing, and we may not either. But the things we do for one another, the things we do for Jesus are charged with eternal significance and purpose. Jesus forgave her sins, and she left there in peace. So here's the good news, right? This life of shame that we are in this constant cycle of, that's never the life that Jesus wanted for us. He came to deal with our shame. He came to help us to deal with our shame. What I love about Jesus is in those moments where shame is revealed, or in some cases when he's the one that actually points it out, he never leaves. He's not surprised by how bad the situation is. He's exactly where he wants to be every single time, to help us deal with our shame and turn us into something new. Our shame wants to push God away, to push others away. Say, get away from me. You don't want to be involved with this. But Jesus can and will make it okay if we let him. I don't know your shame. I don't know what you struggle with. I don't know what you're dealing with. I don't know what forces are out of your control. I don't know what victimizes you, what difficulties haunt you, but I do know this, that Jesus is in the business of taking shame away. He can use our talents, our abilities, even our pain and our shame to make us into someone who can change the world. His plan was never to push us away in shame, but to lift us up into something new. And that's what he can do right now. Jesus takes our lives and makes them into something more than we could even ask or imagine. He has the power to take away shame, but the best news of all is that he wants to. So, if your shame has taken over your life, your identity, your walk of faith, know that you aren't alone. Sometimes we go back to that dry well and we hit our head against that wall again, thinking we'll get different results. But don't stay there. Let us help. If you need prayers, if you need someone to talk to, if you need someone to be there for you, please come. It doesn't have to be during the invitation, because I know that some of us deal with things that we don't want everyone to know about. That's fine. But please, find someone to talk to and don't try to do this alone. So if there's anything we can do for you, please come now as we stand and as we sing.